The luncheon had begun with the usual glitter of society chatter, clinking cutlery, and compliments flung around like confetti. At the grand estate of Sir Rupert and Lady Tremaine, nothing less was expected. Their spring gathering had drawn an enviable guest list: politicians, authors, a retired opera singer, and Lady Tremaine's ever-expanding circle of philanthropic friends, each more theatrically charitable than the last. But by dessert, one of them was dead. Miss Beatrice Morton, a genteel spinster with a formidable reputation in botanical illustration and a lineage as unyielding as her watercolor technique, collapsed shortly after sipping her Earl Grey. Her fingers twitched once as the delicate china cup slipped from her hand and shattered on the terraced tiles. By the time the butler had returned with her scarf, left inside on a chair, Beatrice was lying across the wrought iron table, mouth slightly ajar, eyes wide with what seemed less like fear and more like surprise. Dr. Fawley, a portly gentleman with a tendency to overstate both his credentials and his lunch appointments, rushed forward. He muttered something about arrhythmia, but it was clear from the unnatural stillness of her body and the faint purplish tinge blooming at her lips that Miss Morton had not simply been taken by the strain of conversation. She had been murdered. The incident halted the luncheon abruptly. Lady Tremaine, pale and fluttering, insisted it must be an allergic reaction. Beatrice always had such peculiar dietary needs, she said weakly, while her husband barked instructions to the servants to keep everyone present. Inspector Lambert of the County Constabulary was summoned from nearby Market Wendell. He arrived briskly and began asking practical questions in his usual methodical fashion. Who had served the tea? Who sat next to Miss Morton? Had she eaten the salmon, the cucumber sandwiches? And yet it was none of these practicalities that concerned Hercule Poirot, who had been seated 3 places away from the victim, sipping his own cup of black coffee. He had been invited to the estate as a courtesy. Lady Tremaine was fond of dabbling in continental charm and had always found the famed detective a most elegant presence at any table Poirot had accepted for the quiet, the gardens, and the company of order. But now, murder had once again intruded. He sat silently for a moment, observing the way the guests were beginning to splinter, some clicks forming like cracks in ice. Some whispered behind gloved hands. Others stood stiffly by the balustrade, watching the servants clear away the remains of what had moments before been a cheerful, if pretentious, outdoor affair. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. He did not glance at the teacup or the half-bitten Madeleine beside it. He watched the living. Sir Rupert, crimson with rage or embarrassment, or both, was demanding Lambert not make a bloody circus of this. The opera singer, Madame Sophia, Lagrange, stood aloof, one hand delicately covering her mouth. She had not liked Miss Morton, and she had not hidden it earlier that day. A woman without imagination, she had said, is a garden with no flowers. Nearby, young Henry Kavanagh, an ambitious parliamentary aide, shifted nervously, pulling at his collar as if the air had suddenly thickened. Poirot tapped his finger against his lips. The poison, if poison it was, had worked quickly. Too quickly for an amateur. This was not a slip of extra belladonna in a tincture or an experimental herbal misstep. No, this had the feel of orchestration, control, calculation. Miss Morton had been the sort to observe more than she spoke. He recalled a moment earlier in the afternoon when she had leaned close to the table, lowering her voice to say something to Lady Tremaine. That had prompted a brief but unmistakable frown from their hostess. The guests were now ushered into the drawing-room. Poirot followed slowly, nodding courteously to Inspector Lambert, who was still struggling to assert order. A teacup, yes. But poison, mes amis, that is not merely a chemical. It is a decision. Lady Tremaine caught Poirot's eye and moved toward him with a forced calm. Monsieur Poirot, I can't quite believe this. Beatrice was, well, she was odd, but harmless. What could she possibly have known to provoke this? Poirot inclined his head. Madame, a harmless woman rarely inspires murder. One does not kill without reason, no matter how polite the company. Might I ask, what did Mademoiselle Morton say to you just before tea was served? Lady Tremaine blinked. She mentioned a letter. Said she had come across something quite out of place. She was always cryptic like that. Honestly, I didn't think anything of it. She had a tendency to make mountains of molehills. Oui, Poirot murmured. And yet some molehills conceal gold, or skeletons. He walked to the table where the tea had been served. He did not touch anything, of course. He left fingerprints to the amateurs. But he looked closely. 5 teacups. One of them had been poured later than the others, the ring of its heat still slightly darker on the lace cloth. Miss Morton had arrived a few minutes late to tea. The cup had waited for her. Or had it been meant for someone else? Inspector, Poirot said, turning to Lambert with his usual politeness tinged with iron. I believe we are dealing with a murder both planned and precise. I would advise you not to release any of the guests until the circumstances of this accident are clear. Lambert frowned. And you, sir? You suggest what? That we treat them all as suspects? Poirot's mustache twitched ever so slightly. Inspector, until I find the truth, I suggest you treat them as actors in a play where the script has taken a deadly turn. But rest assured, one of them is not acting at all. And with that, the great detective turned his sign to gaze once more toward the drawing room where 10 faces now waited, each one polished, polite, and perhaps hiding the trace of arsenic behind a smile. The drawing room of Tremaine Hall was a fine blend of polished wood, gilt-framed portraits, and upholstered civility, but now it housed a quieter tension than any portrait could depict. The guests had been arranged not unlike a social chessboard, carefully, evenly spaced, and no longer speaking with ease. The tea service had been cleared, save for the fatal cup now sealed in a velvet-lined evidence box under Inspector Lambert's direction. But Poirot understood well that the cup was not the real vessel of interest. It was these people, this carefully curated circle, who must now be examined, not for what they said, but for what they withheld. Poirot paced slowly, hands behind his back, gaze passing over each guest with that unsettling exactness of his. Let us begin, he said softly, by understanding who we are. A murder has occurred, mes amis, and unless Miss Morton was in the habit of poisoning herself mid-sentence, we must assume the cause lies here, among us. There were 11 guests remaining, excluding Sir Rupert and Lady Tremaine. Poirot began not with questioning but with arrangement. He had the guests seated once more, not according to their comfort, but according to where they had been at the moment of the incident. The terrace luncheon had been informal in theory, but Poirot, like any man who adored precision, had noticed the spatial arrangement from the start. Seating mattered. Who had reached for what? Who could have placed what? Who had the opportunity? To the left of Miss Morton had sat Henry Kavanagh, the nervous young aide with the prematurely receding hairline and an uncertain air about his hands. On her right, the serene and strikingly quiet Mrs. Delphine Edgecombe, a widow whose smile was either soothing or unreadable. Directly across from Miss Morton, Colonel Willoughby, his monocle still gleaming even now, who had grunted through most of the meal. Next to him, his niece Clara Willoughby, who had been more interested in photographing the canapés than conversing with the party. Poirot nodded once. Let us take stock. Each of you had access, but access alone does not equal guilt. No, it is motive that narrows the circle. Lady Tremaine, sitting with a trembling cup of her own now replaced by a glass of sherry, tried to interject. Surely, Monsieur Poirot, this is not necessary. These are our friends. Poirot gave her a gentle, almost apologetic smile. Madame, I do not doubt your sincerity. But murder does not require a villain with a twisted mustache or the raving lunatic of the novels. Murder, in polite society, is far more subtle. He turned to Henry Kavanagh. Monsieur, you were engaged in conversation with Mademoiselle Morton prior to the tea being served, were you not? Henry shifted in his seat. Yes, we were talking about inheritance law. She was curious about something in the new parliamentary bill regarding land trusts. Curious? Poirot tilted his head. Was she merely curious, or did she speak of a matter with personal implication? Henry blinked. I suppose she hinted something about Tremaine land. Said the Tremaines had skeletons in the soil, not the closet. But I didn't press her. Poirot allowed a moment of silence before shifting his attention to Delphine Edgecombe. And you, madame? You were sitting on Miss Morton's right. You said little, I observed. Yet Miss Morton seemed to trust you. Delphine's voice was low, careful. Beatrice and I shared an interest in orchids. She was sending me some of her notes for a manuscript I'm compiling. She mentioned that one of the guests at this luncheon had, how did she phrase it? Roots entangled in deceit. I assumed it was a joke. Poirot's brow rose. Non, madame. Miss Morton was not a woman who joked without purpose. She preferred insinuation to confrontation, mais oui, but she did not speak in riddles for entertainment. Colonel Willoughby cleared his throat. Let's stop beating around the bush. If you're implying one of us put something in her tea, then you'd best be clear about who had the chance. Because I, for one, didn't leave the table. I poured my own drink and ate what was in front of me. Poirot inclined his head. Precisely. But Miss Morton did not pour her own tea. Hers was poured by... He turned subtly toward the butler, who had just re-entered with a list of who had taken which tea. The butler, James, bowed slightly. Sir, Lady Tremaine instructed that tea be poured by myself and Miss Clara. Miss Morton arrived after the initial round was served. I'd stepped away for a moment to retrieve a shawl, and Miss Clara volunteered to pour the final cup. All heads turned to Clara Willoughby, who looked genuinely startled. I only poured it because it was going cold. James had left. It didn't seem unusual. Poirot looked at her closely. Mademoiselle, I'm not accusing you. But you must understand, the chain of events matters. Who poured what? Who handled the cup? Who had a reason, perhaps, to silence Miss Morton? He stepped back and looked at the room as a whole. Let us review. Miss Morton made a cryptic remark about something being out of place. She mentioned a letter. She hinted at deceit. And then she died. Swiftly, deliberately. It is not only a question of who poured the tea. It is also who feared what she knew. He cast his gaze over the remaining guests, the opera singer Lagrange, who had once sued Miss Morton over the use of her likeness in a botanical satire. Mr. Ellis, a publisher with a recent falling out over manuscript rights, and Lady Tremaine's cousin, Augustus Vale, a man whose finances were as unstable as his mood. And then Lady Tremaine herself. Poirot's voice was quiet, now coaxing but firm. A circle of people, all with reason to fear exposure, all with opportunity, and each one now painted by the same brush of suspicion. But one of you, I think, had not only fear, but intent, and with that, Poirot folded his hands. Tomorrow I shall speak to each of you in turn. Not to interrogate, but to understand. The murderer has already played their hand, but I assure you, it was not a perfect move. He turned to Lambert. No one leaves the estate tonight. The truth is not in the teacup, Inspector. It is in the soul of whoever poured it. Though he had been present at the luncheon, Poirot's formal entry into the investigation began the next morning, with the crisp discipline of a man who believed that symmetry and timekeeping were the guardians of truth. He rose at exactly 6:30, dressed immaculately in dove-gray trousers, a matching waistcoat, and a silk cravat that held not a single unintended crease. By 7, he was downstairs in the morning room, notepad in hand, sipping his customary black coffee with a thin slice of orange zest and watching the world unfurl through the mullioned windows of Tremaine Hall. Inspector Lambert arrived shortly after breakfast, visibly tired and annoyed by the press already gathering at the estate gates. "We've kept the story to sudden illness for now," he grumbled, "but someone's leaking details. There are whispers of poison in the local paper." Poirot offered a small nod. "The truth, it seeps out like water under a locked door, mon ami. It cannot be held back for long, and it would be most foolish for us to race it without preparation." Lambert sighed and sat opposite. "You want to start with individual interviews, then?" Poirot smiled faintly. "But of course. The murderer, he will not confess when asked." "No. He will confess through his silences, his contradictions, the small slip of memory when truth becomes uncomfortable." The two men agreed that interviews would be held in the study, an oak-paneled room lined with unread books and a disused fireplace where each guest could sit with nowhere to hide their hands or eyes. Lady Tremaine had granted Poirot full use of the space, and the butler had been instructed to call each person in turn, starting with Clara Willoughby. She entered with the nervous confidence of a woman accustomed to being underestimated. Dressed in a soft blue blouse and a plaid skirt, she carried a leather-bound journal which she clutched like armor. "You were the last to touch Miss Morton's teacup," Poirot began, not accusingly, but with quiet interest. "Tell me, mademoiselle, why did you pour for her?" Clara shrugged lightly. "James had gone inside to fetch her scarf. Everyone else was talking. She asked if her tea was still warm, and I said I'd top it off. I didn't think it mattered. I didn't add anything." "I swear," Poirot nodded. "And the pot? Where was it?" "Right on the table. It hadn't moved. I poured straight from it. And you had not poured anyone else's tea before that?" "No. Everyone else had already been served when I arrived." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "And did Miss Morton say anything when she drank the tea?" Clara hesitated. She made a face. "Like she found it bitter. She said something about it not being quite right, but then she just smiled and sipped again." Poirot scribbled a brief note. "Merci, mademoiselle. Tell me, what was your relationship with Miss Morton?" Clara blinked. "We weren't close. She didn't like cameras. Said they were invasive. But she was always polite to me." He watched her closely as she spoke, observing the slight tremor in her fingers, the brief glance downward when she mentioned the taste of the tea. When she left, Poirot made no remark to Lambert, only gestured for the next guest. Colonel Willoughby entered like a man used to cross-examinations and the luxury of barking out denials before questions were asked. He sat stiffly, his cane resting across his lap. "You think I've got anything to hide?" he began. "Let's get this nonsense out of the way." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Please, Colonel. This is not a court-martial. I merely seek understanding. Tell me, did you see anyone approach the teapot after it was placed?" "No. I was talking with Henry about some nonsense in the press. I wasn't watching the tea." "Do I look like the maid?" Poirot remained unfazed. "And your opinion of Miss Morton?" The Colonel snorted. "Too clever for her own good. Always poking about in business that wasn't hers, but she had her place. Didn't deserve to be poisoned, if that's what this is." "Did she ever speak to you about family matters?" "The Tremaine land? Any conflicts?" "She mentioned something about old wills. Some relative from the 1800s. Told her to stop chasing ghosts. Poirot wrote nothing this time. He simply thanked the Colonel and gestured to the door. "That will be all." Delphine Edgecombe was next. She glided in quietly, wearing a veil over her face, though there had been no funeral. "I was very fond of Beatrice," she said before even sitting. She was blunt, but her honesty was a relief in a room full of social varnish. Poirot inclined his head. She trusted you, perhaps more than others here. She spoke of a letter. Did she show it to you? Delphine hesitated, then answered softly. She mentioned it, yes. Said it was a letter misfiled in Lady Tremain's private cabinet. Something to do with land transfer, illegitimate claims. She said it was the key to a much bigger door, but she didn't show it to me. And now, Poirot asked gently, where is the letter? I don't know. She said she'd return it discreetly, that she only wanted to see it, not expose anyone. But I wonder if someone else overheard. Poirot leaned back, letting the implications unfold, silently. Delphine offered no more. She left gracefully, her hands folded, her eyes dark with concern or something else. Augustus Vale came in next, already apologizing. I know how it looks. My finances are public knowledge. Well, infamous, I should say. But I had no reason to hurt Beatrice. You were in debt, Poirot noted plainly. And Beatrice was one of the trustees of the Tremaine Charity Fund, yes? Yes, but I hadn't asked her for anything. Not recently. Had you done so in the past? A pause. Once. She refused. She said funds weren't for personal patchwork. She used that phrase. I was furious, but that was months ago. Poirot observed the man's crumpled lapels, the threadbare lining of his cuffs. And the letter? Had you heard of it? Only after the fact. Delphine mentioned it last night in confidence. I swear I didn't know Poirot let him go without further comment. The morning wore on. Madame Lagrange arrived in a flurry of perfume and indignation, protesting that any suggestion of her involvement was an insult to art. Henry Kavanagh returned, this time quieter, more composed, but no less vague about the bill Miss Morton had questioned him about. Mr. Ellis, the publisher, claimed he hadn't spoken more than 5 words to Miss Morton all week, though Poirot knew he had received 2 manuscript drafts from her earlier that month. At last, Poirot requested to speak with the butler, James. Calm, loyal, and deliberate in movement, James was difficult to rattle, but Poirot's questions were mild. Did Miss Morton have a habit of wandering the house? Only the library, sir. She seemed interested in the old land records, asked me twice where they were kept. Did she find them? I believe so. She spent the better part of Wednesday afternoon reviewing a file. Wouldn't say what it was. Poirot nodded slowly. And yesterday? The teacups. Did anyone touch the pot between your first service and when you left to retrieve the scarf? James looked thoughtful. Not that I saw, but I passed by Miss Clara standing over the table. Perhaps she was topping off the pot. I can't say for sure. Poirot stood at last, straightening his cuffs. The web was beginning to form, thin threads crossing at delicate points. A letter that had vanished, a teacup poured in absentia, motives that coiled behind smiles, but most of all, fear in each of them for different reasons. Inspector, Poirot said softly, turning to Lambert once more. This case, it is like a clock mechanism. Precise, tightly wound, but one piece, it has been tampered with, and when that happens, the hands point to the wrong hour. Lambert frowned. Meaning? Meaning? Poirot said. Someone has crafted a scene to look like an accident, one that serves not only to silence Miss Morton, but to divert attention entirely. And then, without further explanation, Poirot walked from the Aichiran room and requested the estate's floor plans. The case had begun, not with a death, but with a distraction. The poison was not merely in the teacup, it was in the story being told. Poirot spent the remainder of the morning alone, save for his thoughts and the carefully annotated floor plans of Tremaine Hall. The study, the dining terrace, the drawing room, all interconnected spaces where people moved freely, under the illusion of comfort and casualness. But casualness, Poirot believed, was the enemy of truth. It cloaked motive, muddied timelines, and excused inconsistency. What mattered to him now was not merely who poured the tea, but who moved when and for what reason. By noon, he returned to the drawing room to re-examine the tea service layout. The butler had preserved the exact arrangement under Poirot's instruction. The position of each cup, each saucer, the untouched sugar tongs, nothing had been disturbed. But there was one minor curiosity. One of the spoons had a faint discoloration at the tip, not visible to the eye unless under precise lighting, but Poirot had a fondness for observing what others dismissed. He made a note and left it untouched. Lambert rejoined him after lunch, accompanied by a constable who had been stationed at the gate. "Everyone's accounted for." Nobody left the grounds, though Clara Willoughby asked if she could go for a walk in the orchard. "I said no, très bien," Poirot murmured. "Let us resume, then." He summoned Henry Kavanagh for a second conversation, this time in the garden alcove, away from prying eyes. Poirot's tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp. "Monsieur Kavanagh, you mentioned the late Miss Morton asked about a bill regarding land trusts. This was a public document?" Henry hesitated. Parts of it were. "It's still under committee review." She was interested in how dormant trusts might be contested under the new clauses, and why would that interest her? Henry looked at the ground. She thought someone might have used such a loophole years ago to misappropriate family land. The Tremaines' land, she implied. She said there were documents that didn't match the public records. Did she tell you what she intended to do? She said she wouldn't go to the papers. That she just wanted to correct the record before it was too late? Poirot gave a gentle smile. Too late for whom, I wonder? Henry did not answer. He was dismissed, though Poirot kept his note. Morton had found a discrepancy. That was becoming clear. Next, Poirot called upon Madame Lagrange. She swept into the sitting room in a maroon gown, her perfume trailing behind her like mist. "You are wasted in this role of detective, monsieur," she said, reclining as though she were in rehearsal. "You could have been a playwright." "You enjoy tension?" Poirot smiled politely. "Madame, tension is a symptom. I seek the illness beneath it." He tapped his notepad. "You had a legal disagreement with Mademoiselle Morton, no?" That was years ago. She objected to my autobiography, claimed I had fictionalized a scene based on a luncheon she attended. It was petty. Did you settle the matter? It was dropped. I edited the passage. Poirot leaned forward slightly. "And you bore no grudge?" "None I would act on, monsieur." "I perform tragedies. I do not live them." Poirot said nothing for a moment. Then, quite gently, he asked, "Madame, where were you for the 15 minutes before tea was served?" Lagrange blinked. "I was rehearsing a monologue under the west portico." "Ask anyone, I shall." She left in a swirl of silk. Poirot made another quiet mark in his notebook. There was something theatrical about her fear, not the fear of guilt, but of implication. He moved on to Mr. Ellis, the publisher. Ellis was pale, tired, and dressed plainly in a worn waistcoat with frayed cuffs. "I had nothing to gain from her death," he insisted at once. "Beatrice hadn't published anything with me in 3 years. She sent me her latest sketches, but I didn't even open them. I wasn't interested." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Then why did she write you 2 letters in the past month marked urgent?" Ellis sighed. She believed she'd uncovered something important about the Tremaine estate. She wanted me to help her publish a short exposé, just enough to pressure Lady Tremaine to come clean. I told her I wouldn't touch it without corroboration. "You feared a lawsuit?" "Of course I did. The Tremaines are a family with power, and she had only her word and some old letter she claimed to have copied." Poirot did not speak. He let the silence fill the air until Ellis fidgeted. "Look, I didn't want her dead. I just didn't want her dragging me into a family scandal." Poirot nodded once. "Merci, monsieur." As Ellis left, Poirot was already forming connections. The letter, clearly, had been seen by more than one person. If Morton had shown a draft or even hinted at its contents, someone would have recognized the danger, not just to reputation, but to ownership, to inheritance. That afternoon, Poirot finally requested a private audience with Lady Tremaine herself. She arrived slowly, her composure intact, but her eyes dulled by fatigue. "I'm afraid," she said before he could speak, "that this is becoming a tragedy I can no longer contain." Poirot inclined his head. "That depends, madame, on how much truth you are willing to allow in." She gave a tired smile. "You think I know who did it?" "I think," said Poirot, "that you know what it was Beatrice found." "And whom it endangered?" Lady Tremaine folded her hands. "Years ago there was a change in the land registry. Rupert's grandfather had made certain adjustments. They were never made public. But if Beatrice found the original deed, if she had evidence, it could call our entire estate into legal dispute. I didn't know she had discovered anything until yesterday morning. She came to me and said she would return what she found, but she was worried someone else knew, that they might act before she had the chance." Poirot nodded slowly. "And did you believe her?" "Yes. That's why I didn't drink my tea." Poirot blinked once. "Pardon?" "I switched to sherry. I don't know why. I just felt a chill. Beatrice's tone frightened me." Poirot stood. "Madame, I believe you. But it also means someone else feared she would not remain silent, and they acted first." As evening approached, Poirot reviewed his notes again. One thing stood out, not a statement, but an omission. In all their recollections, no one had mentioned what Beatrice had done after reading the letter. But someone had said she visited the library, and James, the butler, had confirmed she asked about land documents. Poirot returned there now, alone, and studied the locked filing cabinet in the far corner. With permission, he requested the key from Lady Tremaine. Inside the cabinet were ledgers, old correspondences, and tucked between two property records, a slim leather notebook. On the inner cover, in elegant script, B. Morton, and on the final page, letter copied. "If anything happens to me, it is not a coincidence." Poirot stared at the line for a long moment, then placed the notebook in his coat pocket and turned slowly. He did not yet know who had delivered the poison, but he now knew why. Miss Morton had not merely been murdered for a letter. She had been murdered for the truth. News of the discovery, though Poirot shared it with no one, changed his posture. He no longer questioned to gather facts. Now he sought alignment, to test what each suspect believed he knew against what Poirot already suspected. The notebook had been a confirmation, not a revelation. Miss Morton had anticipated danger, had made a copy of the letter, and had known that she might not live long enough to confront it directly. She had placed the burden of truth in Poirot's hands. Now he would see how the guilty handled the possibility that truth had not died with her. Inspector Lambert, meanwhile, believed he had found the solution. "Kavanaugh," he said, pacing the hallway beside Poirot, "is our man. The motive is straightforward. He's working with the Land Trust Reform Committee, and if it came out that he was party to inherited land being mishandled, possibly fraudulently, his career would be over." Poirot said nothing. He admits Miss Morton told him about the deed discrepancy, and she said she'd make it public if the family didn't resolve it. Suppose he feared she'd drag him down with the rest. He had access to the teacups. He sat beside her. It fits Poirot still said nothing. "And," Lambert added, warming to the idea, "we found a small phial of powdered aconite in his travel bag." That stopped Poirot. He turned slowly. "Aconite?" Lambert nodded. "Under his socks in a hidden compartment." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "That is not a subtle poison, Inspector." Aconite causes violent convulsions and immediate respiratory distress. What happened to Miss Morton was elegant, silent. Clean, Lambert gave a dismissive shrug. Maybe he didn't know what he was doing. Maybe he meant it to be untraceable. Non, said Poirot firmly. Aconite is crude, brutal. Miss Morton's death was not messy. Her symptoms, minor muscle twitching, lips blue but no spittle, no contortions, suggest something far more refined. Perhaps cyanide or digitalis, possibly strychnine in a minuscule dose, but not aconite. Still, Lambert insisted, he had motive, he had access. And the poison Poirot shook his head. He had fear, yes. But so do many others here, and the poison, I suspect, was not carried in a bottle but prepared in advance. It was in place before Miss Morton lifted her cup. Lambert narrowed his eyes. You're not letting go of this easily, are you? Poirot turned away. Non, mon ami, because this solution, it is too early. The true murderer has not yet made their mistake. Lambert wasn't convinced, but he agreed to question Kavanagh further while Poirot returned to the terrace. There, he stood before the spot where Miss Morton had died. The garden chairs had been moved, the tablecloths replaced, but the sunlit quiet of the place made the memory vivid. He tried to replay every moment. Miss Morton arriving late, Clara pouring her tea the moment she had taken her first sip. Had the cup already been prepared, or had something been added during that brief absence, when James fetched the scarf? Poirot crouched near the table's edge and examined the stone beneath. There were still small shards of the shattered teacup lodged in the cracks. With gloved fingers, he retrieved one and held it to the light. A faint residue clung to the inside curve, not tea, but something pale and crystalline. He secured the shard in an envelope and returned inside. Meanwhile, Lambert pressed Kavanagh harder. The young man wilted quickly under pressure. I didn't do it, he repeated again and again. Yes, I had aconite. It was for personal research. I've been reading up on toxicology for a policy review. I shouldn't have brought it here. It looks bad, I know, but I never touched her cup. I didn't even pour the tea. Lambert scoffed. You didn't need to. The pot was on the table. All it would take is a moment alone. But I wasn't alone, Henry snapped, rising suddenly. Ask Clara. She was right there. She poured her tea, then Miss Morton's Poirot, entering just then, lifted a hand. Enough, monsieur. Sit. Henry sat, breathing hard. Poirot addressed Lambert. I would like to speak to Miss Clara Willoughby again. Alone, she arrived moments later, clearly unsettled. I already told you everything, Poirot gestured to the seat across from him. Oui, mademoiselle, and now I ask again for your patience. Because details, they change, do they not, when one has time to reflect? She sat slowly, folding her hands. You poured Miss Morton's tea. Did you taste it beforehand? What number? Why would I? Poirot tilted his head. And yet you were drinking from the same pot. I suppose so. And where was your cup after her collapse? Clara blinked. I left it on the table. I didn't even finish it. Poirot leaned forward. Where is that cup now? I don't know. The servants cleared it, didn't they? Poirot stood. Come with me, mademoiselle. He led her to the kitchen, where a tray of washed dishes had been neatly stacked. He asked the maid on duty which cups had come from the luncheon. Only one bore an unusual detail, a faint pink film around the inner rim. Poirot requested it be tested immediately. Clara said nothing the entire time, but her face had turned very pale. You believe I tried to poison her, she whispered as they walked back to the main hall. I believe, said Poirot quietly, that someone wanted us to believe that Henry Kavanagh did. She froze. What? The aconite in his bag. Placed too conveniently. The overheard argument between him and Miss Morton, easy to quote out of context. But the true method, mademoiselle, was delicate, and whoever administered it did so knowing that suspicion would fall on the one already nervous, already flawed. Clara's voice wavered. "Are you accusing me?" "No, mademoiselle. I'm observing Poirot returned her to her room and then sought out Delphine Edgecombe once more. She was in the conservatory, seated among orchids." "You were close to Miss Morton," Poirot said. "Yes. And you knew she feared retaliation?" Delphine nodded. "She told me the night before she died that someone had followed her while she was walking the gardens. She said she thought it was Augustus Vale. Did you see him that evening?" "I passed him near the stables." He looked angry. Poirot nodded slowly. "You have been truthful, madame. But I wonder, have you also been silent?" She did not answer, but her hands, resting on her lap, tightened slightly. When Poirot returned to Lambert that evening, the inspector was already preparing a warrant for Kavanagh's arrest. "I urge you to delay it," Poirot said. "The poison in Miss Morton's cup was not aconite. The residue from the cup and from the shard I recovered on the terrace point to a refined form of cyanide, cleverly masked." Lambert grimaced. "So what do we do? Wait for another death?" "No," Poirot replied. "We wait for someone to make a move. Now that the aconite has been exposed, the murderer must pivot, and in doing so, they will reveal themselves that night." Poirot did not sleep. He sat by the window in the guest quarters of Tremaine Hall, watching the corridor. At precisely 2 a.m, a figure moved past his door, quiet, cloaked, but hurried. Poirot followed. The figure led him not to the study, not to the terrace, but to the locked west wing, unused and shuttered. Poirot waited until they vanished behind a door, then stepped forward and knocked sharply. There was silence. Then a voice, Augustus Vale's, called, "Who is it?" Poirot opened the door without asking. Vale stood in the middle of the room, holding a sheet of paper in one hand and a candle in the other. On the table behind him, a packet of letters, some of them bearing Miss Morton's handwriting. "I can explain," Vale said quickly. "I'm listening," said Poirot. "But know this, the murderer has already lied once. They will not lie again without consequence." Vale looked down at the letters and back at Poirot. "I didn't kill her. But I knew what she found, and I tried to make it disappear." Poirot stepped inside. "Then you are not the killer, monsieur. But perhaps, just perhaps, you know who is." The air in the West Wing study was musty, filled with the forgotten scent of paper and shuttered sunlight. Poirot stood in silence while Augustus Vale, eyes darting between the detective and the documents he had hoped to remove unnoticed, wrestled with the dawning realization that secrets, especially those tied to murder, have long shadows. "I swear to you," Vale muttered, dropping the sheet he held, "I didn't poison her. I only wanted these letters out of sight. If they were found—" Poirot raised a hand gently. "There's no need to convince me further, monsieur. If you were the murderer, you would not have returned here. A killer does not linger to tidy their motives." Vale looked half relieved, half panicked. Then why did I feel like someone was watching me? For 2 nights now. I felt it outside my window. Poirot studied him for a moment. "Guilt creates ghosts, Monsieur Vale, but you are not imagining it. The true murderer suspects someone may uncover their trail. That fear is now driving them to act again." He walked slowly to the pile of letters Vale had tried to hide. Many were inconsequential, family correspondences, committee notes, old bills. But one was different, a carbon copy of the letter Beatrice Morton had spoken of. A handwritten transcription of a legal transfer between Rupert Tremaine's grandfather and an unnamed buyer using falsified land claims. Miss Morton must have found this and realized the implications, Poirot murmured. Whoever currently profits from that altered deed would be at risk of losing everything. Vale exhaled shakily. "That's not me." "It's not my land," Poirot nodded. "I believe you. But let me give you a warning, monsieur. Burn nothing. Hide nothing. If the real killer believes you know too much, you will not be offered a second warning." He left the room with the letter in hand and returned to his chambers. There, he placed the copy in a sealed envelope, labeled it with his distinctive looping handwriting, and handed it to James the butler. "Please place this in Lady Tremain's personal safe. Do not open it. Do not discuss it. Guard it well." James gave a slight bow. "Of course, sir." Poirot spent the remainder of the morning walking the estate grounds. Not aimlessly. Each step was deliberate. He allowed himself to be seen. He stopped and exchanged polite greetings with each guest he passed. He asked after sleep, dreams, comfort. He remarked on the warmth of the spring wind and the way the light filtered through the orchard trees, but always, his eyes watched how they responded. Clara Willoughby was stiff, avoiding eye contact, as though expecting accusation with every glance. Madame Lagrange was loud, even theatrical in her nervousness, repeatedly expressing shock at the continued delay in arresting someone, anyone. Delphine Edgecombe, graceful and reserved, was not walking at all. She remained seated under the pergola, watching the others, still, alert. Poirot sat beside her after some time. "You are observant, madame." "I have to be," she replied. "People always say more when they are quiet." He nodded slowly. "Miss Morton trusted you. She must have spoken to you about the others." "She had opinions," Delphine said carefully. She thought Henry was in over his head, Clara too concerned with appearances, Lagrange petty and vindictive. But she never mentioned Augustus. She avoided him. Poirot smiled faintly. Because she had already decided he was guilty of something. Or she pitied him. There was silence between them for a time. Then Poirot stood. "Would you permit me, madame, to ask a very strange question?" Delphine raised an eyebrow. "Of course." "If you were to commit a murder," Poirot asked, "not out of passion but necessity, how would you ensure that guilt passed to another?" She did not flinch. "I would use what the person fears most. Make them believe it was their own fault. Let their panic become my shield." Poirot bowed. "Merci." That afternoon, Poirot requested a fresh gathering. All guests were called into the drawing room, this time with a twist. Each was asked to bring the cup they had drunk from during the luncheon. All cups had been washed, yes, but Poirot explained calmly that this was merely a test of memory, of awareness, of detail. He handed out identical replacements and then asked each person to position the cups as they recalled. The exercise felt like theater. Uneasy glances passed across the room. Clara hesitated before selecting a cup with a chip, though Poirot remembered hers had no such flaw. Henry picked one confidently. Lagrange argued that hers had gold trim, which the replacements did not. Only Delphine declined. "I don't remember. I was served last," I think Poirot made no correction. Instead, he offered a simple remark. "It is curious, is it not, how memory changes under pressure?" Then he invited them to a final game. "One of you," he said, "is lying. And I will tell you something more. One of you has already attempted to mislead me again. Someone placed a second dose of poison into a sugar cube, which I discovered an hour ago in the morning tea tray." The reaction was electric. Lady Tremaine gasped audibly. Henry stepped back. Clara clutched her wrist. Only Delphine and Lagrange remained still. "Madness," Lagrange said at last. "Why would anyone poison a sugar cube now?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Because they believe someone knows. And rather than wait for exposure, they would strike again." He moved to the window, letting silence stretch out. Then, turning suddenly, he asked, "Madame Lagrange, when did you last visit the morning room?" She blinked. Yesterday evening. Strange. Your perfume lingered there at 8 o'clock this morning. Her face darkened. Are you accusing me? No, madame. But I am saying the murderer is afraid, and fear drives action. Poirot ended the meeting shortly after, but not before making a quiet request that none of the guests leave their rooms for the evening. He needed one final night to confirm what he suspected. That night, as the hall fell silent, Poirot once again waited by his door. This time, he did not wait long. A shadow passed, not toward the west wing, but the kitchen. Poirot followed without sound. He found Delphine Edgecombe standing at the counter, glass vial in hand, tilting it gently toward a teapot. "Madame," Poirot said softly. She did not turn. "I thought you might be the one to find me." Poirot stepped into the light. "Miss Morton trusted you. She confided in you. She called you her friend." "She was," Delphine said, almost to herself, "and I did not want to kill her." But she wouldn't stop. She was going to ruin everything. Poirot's voice remained calm. She had the letter. She had the truth. She was going to hand it over to a solicitor. Expose the Tremaines. The family's land, their foundation. It was all built on that forgery. My family. My future. If it came out, I'd lose everything. Poirot said nothing. "She drank the tea," Delphine whispered. "And I thought that would be it." But then the letter copy went missing. And Vale started sniffing about. "Then you came. You planned to poison again." Delphine nodded once. "I wasn't going to kill. Just scare. Remind you all that danger hadn't passed." Poirot stepped forward. "You are clever, madame, but cleverness without conscience is chaos." She dropped the vial. It shattered on the tile. Poirot's voice did not rise. "You will come with me now." "It is finished." Delphine Edgecombe said nothing as the constables took her from the estate before dawn. Poirot remained standing in the kitchen, eyes closed, listening to the silence that followed her departure. The game had been played, and it was over. But justice, Poirot knew, was not merely about punishment. It was about understanding why a quiet woman would murder her closest friend, not in rage, but in fear. That answer, perhaps, would take longer to reveal. The arrest of Delphine Edgecombe should have ended the affair. The guests breathed with the hesitant relief of people waking from a fever dream, and Inspector Lambert moved quickly to secure her statement. Lady Tremaine wept softly in the drawing-room. Augustus Vale shut himself in the library. The others drifted through the hall like stunned survivors, eyes flicking toward Poirot with renewed reverence and fear. But Poirot, for all his reputation, did not celebrate. He had seen confessions before. Some came easily, dripping with remorse. Others were laced with panic. But Delphine's had been different. Calculated. Careful. Too careful. He sat in the study alone that morning, reviewing his notes with military precision. Everything fit. Her proximity to Miss Morton, her knowledge of the deed, her emotional proximity disguised as friendship. She had motive, access, calmness. And yet something trembled at the edges of the case. Poirot had a name for it. Imbalance. Delphine had moved too early. She had risked poisoning a second time when the first act had nearly slipped past unnoticed. That was not the work of a woman who planned cleanly. It was fear. Yes, but it felt like fear of being framed, not fear of being caught. By noon, the constables returned from the county station with disturbing news. "She's dead," Lambert said flatly, standing in the doorway with his coat still on. Delphine Edgecombe. She was being held in the interim cell until transport. Collapsed 20 minutes after drinking the tea brought to her. Poirot stood slowly. "Tea. Standard issue, served by one of the junior staff." Nobody thought anything of it. No visitors, no access to the holding area, except staff. Poirot's expression darkened. The murderer is still at large. Lambert looked confused. She confessed. No, Inspector, Poirot said coldly. She rehearsed. The confession was prepared, offered, handed to us like a well-wrapped parcel, because someone needed her to take the blame, publicly and neatly. Lambert's face tightened. You're saying she didn't poison Miss Morton? She might have believed she had to, or believed she would be next if she didn't cooperate. Poirot began pacing, but she was not a woman built for murder. She lacked the full ruthlessness, and someone watched her fall into the trap and ensured she would not speak again. They reviewed the estate guest list once more. Poirot made a quiet request that no one be informed of Delphine's death yet. He wanted their behavior undisturbed. The murderer was still playing, and in any game of manipulation, the unguarded moment was everything. That afternoon, Poirot summoned the guests individually under the pretext of final interviews before their release. He watched closely, not for guilt, but for performance. Clara Willoughby appeared exhausted but relieved. She spoke of moving on, returning to London, trying to forget it all. Her tears were genuine, her dread real. She was no longer a suspect in Poirot's mind, just a young woman shaken by truths that exceeded her world. Madame Lagrange, too, had softened her flamboyance. She was nervous now, shrunken into herself. Delphine, she said when asked how close they'd been. I never liked her, but I never imagined she would, you know. Poirot noted the pause, the hesitation, but nothing more came. Augustus Vale was pale and cautious. I was in the library all night, he repeated. Didn't see or hear anything. Didn't want to. Poirot asked nothing about Delphine. Vale offered no opinions. Poirot took note. Henry Kavanagh, summoned last, looked like a man recovering from surgery. Hollowed eyes, shrunken posture. She said I'd be blamed, he told Poirot softly. Miss Morton, she said if anything happened, I'd look like the obvious choice. Because of the aconite. She didn't know about that. I think she meant because I was nervous, because I argued with her once in front of people. Poirot nodded. Do you think Delphine Edgecombe killed her? Henry shook his head slowly. No, she wasn't brave enough. Smart enough, maybe. But not bold enough. Would you know who was? Henry hesitated. I thought it might be Augustus. He had the most to lose. But now, I don't know. Poirot did not press. He let the silence stretch until Henry fidgeted. After the last guest had been dismissed, Poirot called for James, the butler. The envelope I left in the safe, Poirot said. Is it still there? James went to check. He returned within minutes, eyes wide. Gone, he whispered. The safe was locked, undisturbed. But the envelope is not inside. Poirot stood. The criminal has overplayed their hand, he said to no one in particular. They have struck again, fearing exposure. But now I know them. He did not call for Lambert, he did not summon the guests. Instead, he requested that a final supper be served that evening, an informal meal in the conservatory, where tensions might relax. Everyone came. The room was warm with candlelight, the breeze gentle through the open arches. Small talk returned in fragments. People smiled, though it never reached the eyes. Poirot, dressed immaculately as always, ate nothing. He simply watched. It was during the tea service, ironically, poetically, that Poirot rose to speak. Mesdames et messieurs, he began, we sit here now, believing that the nightmare has ended. That justice has been served, that Delphine Edgecombe, our quietly dangerous friend, was the one who laced the cup and silenced the truth. All eyes turned. Poirot's voice was calm. But that is not the truth. Delphine was used, frightened, forced, and then she was silenced by the real murderer who poisoned her in custody to close the story cleanly. A hush fell. The letter she tried to protect, my copy of it, was stolen this morning. That theft could only have been committed by someone with knowledge of both the safe and its location. Someone comfortable in the house. Someone no one would suspect Lady Tremaine set her teacup down with a soft clink. Poirot turned toward her. "You knew of the letter," he said gently. "You feared its revelation. But you did not kill for it. You simply hoped it would go away." She nodded faintly. Poirot looked to the others. "I now present to you the true killer, the one who manipulated Delphine, who planted the aconite in Kavanagh's luggage, who poisoned a second time to erase all traces of their scheme. The one person with access, opportunity, and reason, who knew where the letter was, who could enter any room unnoticed." He turned slowly. "James." The butler froze. For a moment, silence reigned. Then, "Sir, you were loyal to the Tremaines, yes, but not to the law. When you overheard Miss Morton speaking of the deed, you panicked, because it was you, not Rupert's grandfather, who forged the registry years ago. You who altered the documents when you worked as a clerk before becoming the family servant. It was your hand that shifted the boundary line, your deceit that kept the Tremaine fortune alive. If exposed, you would not only be ruined, you would be imprisoned." James's lips parted. No sound emerged. "You feared she had proof," Poirot continued. "You heard her tell Delphine she had copied the letter. And you turned to Delphine, convinced her that Miss Morton would destroy her life too, that she had to be stopped. But you handled the poison. You placed it. She only poured the tea, and when you saw her falter under pressure, you poisoned her too." A gasp broke the room. James stepped back, but not far. "I never meant to," he began. Poirot raised a hand. "You meant to survive." James did not run. He simply sat down. Inspector Lambert entered moments later, having listened from the adjoining corridor. The arrest was silent, dignified. The man who had once served tea now walked away in handcuffs. Poirot sat again. The case was nearly over, but in the minds of the guests the echoes would last. A poisoned teacup, yes, but beneath it, a poisoned legacy. Greed, fear, silence. Poirot, as he folded his napkin, said only, "Justice, it is sometimes slow, but it never forgets." The conservatory gradually emptied after James was taken away, leaving behind the faint rustle of linen napkins, the last echoes of clinking silver, and the silent astonishment of a group of people who had shared murder with their midday tea. Poirot did not immediately join the retreating footsteps. He remained seated, fingertips lightly pressed together beneath his chin, eyes half-lidded as if in prayer, though it was not to God he now spoke, but to memory. He had known for 2 days, not the identity, not the confession, but the rhythm. The murder had a symmetry to it, an almost mechanical precision that echoed not the mind of an impulsive killer, but that of a man who had built his life on routine and silence. James had never drawn attention to himself. That had been his talent and his flaw. It had all started with a spoon, not the poisoned teacup, not even the letter. A spoon. Poirot stood and walked back into the house, bypassing the drawing room where Lambert was taking statements from the guests who still reeled from the new truth. He made his way once more to the kitchen, where the dinner dishes had begun to pile in. The air held the steamy fragrance of lemon soap and boiled vegetables. He asked the scullery maid for the tea utensils used during the luncheon, the very first one, where Beatrice Morton had died. To her credit, she remembered. The chipped saucer, the long-handled tongs, the sugar bowl with the silver rim, and the spoons. Poirot took them, one by one, examining them against the light. It was not something visible to an untrained eye, but to Poirot, trained as he was in symmetry and patterns, the detail was striking. One spoon had a faint groove on its underside, as though its bowl had been delicately filed down. He returned to his notes and checked again. Beatrice had stirred her tea, made a comment about it tasting not quite right, and then drank again. Her death had been swift, unaccompanied by violent symptoms. There had been no obvious sign of bitterness, no immediate rejection. Digitalis, perhaps, or cyanide in an organic compound. Either would dissolve quickly in warm liquid, and both could have been applied directly to the underside of a spoon if finely powdered and carefully scraped on. The poison had not been in the pot. It had not been in the cup. It had been on the spoon. That was the hidden clue. Only someone with precise access, someone trusted to lay the utensils, could have arranged it. The butler had set the table personally that day, something Poirot had confirmed with James himself during one of their earliest conversations. "Everything must be placed correctly," James had said. "I don't like servants who rush through preparation." Poirot had smiled politely at the time, but now he saw the full picture. Miss Morton arrived late to the table. Her place had been set earlier, untouched, waiting. A poisoned spoon rested in position, unnoticed among silver, nearly identical to the rest. The tea poured later had merely completed the trap. Whoever poured it, Clara Willoughby, was irrelevant. The mechanism had already been wound. All it needed was her hand. Poirot removed the poisoned spoon from the bunch and placed it carefully in a separate pouch. He would have it analyzed in London, but he already knew what they would find. Back in his room, Poirot reviewed his second hidden clue, the copied letter, or rather, the envelope that had contained it. When James had claimed not to know of its disappearance, Poirot had quietly examined the safe himself. The lock had not been forced. There were no scratches. The combination remained unchanged. The access, in other words, was granted. Poirot had left a small piece of lint beneath the envelope when he placed it there, woven from a green thread cut from his own waistcoat lining, a trick he'd used many times. The lint was gone, which meant the envelope had not been removed and returned. It had been taken entirely, not by someone who cracked the safe, but by someone with permission or a key. James, again. He had overseen that safe for decades, had witnessed the placement of documents, had observed the rhythms of the household so long that the hiding of secrets had become part of his routine. And this final theft of the one document that confirmed his role in the original forgery was not an act of impulse. It was self-preservation. Poirot sat at the writing desk and opened Delphine Edgecombe's original testimony, still in Lambert's possession but provided to him for review. It was measured, lacking in real detail. She had named no poison, had not described the method. She had merely said, "I did it because I was afraid. I poured the tea. I thought it would end there, and perhaps it would have, had she not known too much afterward." Poirot turned to his final piece of evidence, the cleaning schedule for the serving staff. On the day before the murder, James had assigned himself to supervise the silver cleaning. That included the tea set. Every item on that table had passed through his hands in preparation for the luncheon, including the spoons. Poirot had not spoken these conclusions aloud yet. There would be time for that during the final gathering. But for now, he stared at the silent weight of truth on the page. What drove a man like James? Not greed, exactly. The original forgery had likely not benefited him directly. He had altered a deed under pressure, maybe at the request of a superior, or in loyalty to the family he later came to serve. But once the fraud had been embedded into the Tremaine fortune, the risk of exposure never left. He had built a life within the lie. And when Miss Morton came too close to digging it up, he acted not to defend the Tremaines, but to defend himself. Poirot stood and returned to the terrace once more, where a breeze had risen through the hedges and the scent of lavender mingled with the afternoon haze. The case, as it appeared to everyone else, was now solved. But Poirot knew better. because the hidden clue had not simply revealed the method, it had revealed the soul, the placement of the spoon, the theft of the letter, the control of the scene. These were not the actions of someone improvising. They were the marks of a man who had trained his entire life to be invisible. That was what James had perfected. Not just the act of service, but the art of disappearance. He blended, he obeyed, he smiled, and no one ever looked at him long enough to wonder what secrets he was hiding in his pocket. Poirot, standing among the roses, closed his notebook slowly. There would be a final gathering, and this time the curtain would not merely rise on the murderer. It would reveal every thread. It was just after 8 when the guests were summoned once more to the drawing room of Tremaine Hall. The storm that had been brewing on the horizon had broken earlier in the evening, and now the windows shuddered against the soft percussion of rain, as if nature itself wished to cleanse the estate of the past week's deceit. Lamps had been lit, casting elongated shadows across the walls, and the fireplace glowed dimly, not for warmth, but for atmosphere. There was an unmistakable sense among the assembled group that this would be the last time they gathered like this. Lady Tremaine sat nearest the fire, her hands clasped in her lap, eyes hollow from sleeplessness. Augustus Vale remained by the drinks cabinet, not touching anything, just standing with a tight grip on the armrest of the nearest chair. Madame Lagrange perched near the window, her usual dramatic posture stiffened into uneasy silence. Clara Willoughby clutched a small notebook to her chest, unsure if she was meant to take notes or shield herself with it. Henry Kavanagh, pale and blinking, sat alone at the far end of the settee, trying to appear composed, but failing at the corners of his mouth. And then came Poirot, alone, without Inspector Lambert or any constables. He walked slowly to the center of the room, adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, and looked at no one for a long moment. "Mes amis," he began quietly, "this has been a case of appearances, of masks, of things placed just so. The tragedy of Mademoiselle Morton's death is not only that it was violent, but that it was disguised as subtlety. She was silenced not in a frenzy, but in a performance." The room remained still. Poirot's voice, calm and measured, echoed slightly in the silence. "We have seen confessions, we have even seen a second death, but the truth, as always, lies deeper. Let me begin from the beginning, when Miss Morton arrived late to the terrace luncheon." He paced slowly, tapping his fingers together rhythmically. Her seat had been set, her cup placed, her spoon arranged, her tea was poured, yes, by Mademoiselle Clara, but the fatal substance had already been introduced, not into the liquid, not into the sugar, but onto the underside of a spoon that had been placed at her setting hours earlier. Clara gasped softly. Poirot gave her a brief glance, but did not stop. That spoon contained a micro-layer of powdered digitalis, a cardiac glycoside derived from the foxglove plant. Tasteless, slow in effect, and in proper doses. Lethal. Once stirred into hot tea, it dissolved instantly. Madame Lagrange leaned forward. But who would... Poirot raised a hand. "We are coming to that." He turned toward Henry Kavanagh. "You, monsieur, were made to appear guilty. The phial of aconite in your bag, the argument with Miss Morton. These were carefully selected signs of suspicion, but the poison she ingested was not aconite. Your fear, your anxiety, they were not guilt, but anticipation. You feared you were being watched, perhaps even framed." Henry nodded faintly. "I did," Poirot continued. "Then we have poor Madame Edgecombe. She was convinced, no doubt subtly manipulated, that Miss Morton's discoveries would endanger everyone. That exposure of the forged deed would destroy the family name, the estate, the future of all involved. And someone with intimate knowledge of the house, the staff, and the past, used that fear. She was not the origin of the crime, only a participant in a much older deception, And when she grew unsteady, when the walls began to close in, the real killer ended her life with a second dose of poison, administered quietly, tragically, in her holding cell. Lady Tremaine flinched. But if it wasn't her, Poirot turned slowly. It was James. The room stilled. Not a breath was heard. The butler, Poirot continued, knew everything, not just of the household, but of its past. Long before he donned the white gloves and served champagne to your guests, he worked in clerical service. In his youth, under a different name, he handled documentation for the local land office. It was there he altered the deed, an act done not for profit, but likely at the urging of Rupert Tremaine's grandfather. But James was the hand that made it real. Augustus Vale's brow furrowed. But that was decades ago. "We," said Poirot, and he has lived ever since with that knowledge. And when Miss Morton, in her stubborn curiosity, found the copy of the letter when she planned to confront the matter directly, James saw his entire life flash before him, his loyalty, his silence, his future, all at risk. Poirot paused. The fire crackled. He planned the murder with care, chose the spoon, placed it himself. Then he gently nudged suspicion toward others, toward Henry, toward Delphine. And when Delphine began to unravel, he took the step no loyal servant should. He poisoned her as well. Lady Tremaine spoke at last, her voice brittle. "I trusted him with everything. He was family." Poirot nodded slowly. "That, madame, is what made him dangerous. He knew you would never suspect him. None of you would. He pulled from his pocket a velvet pouch. Inside this pouch is the spoon recovered from Miss Morton's original place setting. Lab tests will confirm digitalis residue on its surface." He produced a second envelope, and this is a copy of the stolen letter. The real one, which I never placed in the safe, but instead hid in my own room. The envelope in the safe was blank. Bait. James took it, thinking he had removed the final proof. But he only exposed himself. He turned then to each guest. "Clara Willoughby, you were used, but you were innocent. Henry Kavanagh, you were framed, and you bore the weight of it bravely. Augustus Vale, you were weak, but not wicked. Madame Lagrange, you were a performer, but never a killer. And Lady Tremaine, you were too proud to admit what you already feared." Silence followed. Poirot gave them a moment to sit with the truth. "I have informed the proper authorities," he said at last. "James will be charged with both murders. He has confessed under questioning. He claimed it was all to protect the family, but in the end, it was to protect himself from the consequences of a lie long buried." Poirot turned to the door, then paused. "You see, murder is never just about the moment. It is about what came before. The thing the murderer fears most is not being caught. It is being known." And with that, Hercule Poirot stepped from the room, the weight of justice behind him and the storm finally beginning to pass. The rain continued through the night, steady now, as though the storm had found a rhythm. Within Tremaine Hall, most had gone to bed. But Poirot, ever meticulous, remained awake. He sat alone in the library, the small lamp casting a golden glow over the chessboard set between two armchairs. A game was half played, an earlier distraction never resumed. The Black King stood vulnerable. Poirot tapped his index finger on the polished table as he stared at it, his thoughts not on the board, but on the crime that had unfolded with such quiet cruelty. A knock came at the door. It was Lambert. "They've taken him," the inspector said. No resistance. He didn't even raise his voice. Poirot nodded once. Lambert hesitated. "He said something odd." Poirot raised his eyes. He said, "Tell Poirot he saw it all before anyone else. I just didn't think he'd look that close." Poirot's voice was quiet. "Because no one ever does, Inspector. That is the fate of a servant. To exist between visibility and insignificance, Lambert crossed the room and sat down across from Poirot. You were right. About everything. The spoon, the safe, the manipulation. He kept everything under control, until Beatrice Morton started asking questions. She was not the first to notice something strange, Poirot said, but she was the first with the courage to press forward. Lambert shook his head. But he lived in this house for over 20 years. Surely someone must have seen something. Poirot folded his hands. People do not see what they are accustomed to. We learn to ignore what is always present. And James used that to perfection. His entire identity was wrapped in the trust others placed in him. No one looked twice at the man who poured the tea. Lambert leaned forward. But Delphine Edgecombe. Do you really think she believed she was acting alone? No, Poirot said quietly. She was afraid. James convinced her, perhaps not overtly, but with implication. She believed she had no choice, that Miss Morton would destroy the family, the inheritance, perhaps even expose past misdeeds tied to her own relatives. James simply let her believe it was her idea. Poirot reached for a folder on the side table. Here is something that may interest you. The original land transfer. Beatrice Morton had it partially decoded. She found a clause misaligned with property laws of the era. That was the forgery. The name on it was Rupert Tremane's grandfather. But the handwriting matched clerical documents filed by a young assistant registrar at the time Lambert opened the folder, scanning the signature. James Harwood, he muttered. Under a different surname, then. Poirot nodded. He was never in the Tremaine family's service until years later. But by the time he arrived at the Hall, the forgery was old, forgotten, and profitable. He slid into position. A servant with a secret is a dangerous man. Lambert sat back. And you knew? I suspected. But I had to be certain. Once the spoon revealed the method and the envelope the motive, the man revealed himself. Silence returned. Poirot returned his gaze to the chessboard. Lambert watched him for a moment before standing. I'll make my report. Bon, Poirot murmured, not looking up. After Lambert left, Poirot stood and walked through the now empty halls of Tremaine Hall. The ancestral paintings watched him pass. He paused before one, a stern man with grey whiskers, presumably Rupert's grandfather. The origin of the fortune. The man whose legacy had been built, quite literally, on a lie. Poirot stared at him for a long time. In the morning, the guests began to leave. Augustus Vale was first. He shook Poirot's hand without a word and disappeared down the front steps like a man who had seen his own reflection and didn't much care for it. Clara Willoughby followed, shoulders hunched, clutching her notebook, eyes darting between the remaining faces like a schoolchild unsure if she'd passed or failed the test. Madame Lagrange left dramatically, of course. Coat draped, perfume trailing, casting one last, withering glance at the portrait gallery. Only Henry Kavanagh remained behind a little longer. He approached Poirot on the veranda, where the air was crisp from the rain. I want to thank you, he said quietly. Poirot inclined his head. You are not the first to be accused unjustly, Monsieur Kavanagh. Nor will you be the last. But you bore it with dignity. I didn't feel dignified, Henry replied with a thin smile. I felt terrified. Courage is not the absence of fear. Fear, Poirot said, but the action taken in spite of it. Henry nodded, then hesitated. Do you think Miss Morton knew what would happen? Poirot considered this. She knew the risk. She copied the letter. She gave hints. She even told multiple people what she had found. That is not the behavior of someone seeking secrecy. It is the behavior of someone trying to leave a trail. She was brilliant, Henry said softly. And she died because of it. Poirot looked out at the gardens. No, monsieur. She died because someone believed the truth would destroy them. But truth does not kill. Fear does with that. Henry stepped away, suitcase in hand, and walked down the gravel path. Poirot remained for an hour more. The staff had resumed their duties, though quieter now, as if afraid to speak too loudly within the walls that had housed death and deception. Lady Tremaine asked to see Poirot before he left. They met in the drawing-room, sunlight pouring through the tall windows. "I've lost everything," she said bluntly. Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Not the estate," she added. "The illusion. I believed we were a family of honor, of integrity. But our name is forged. Our foundation poisoned, literally and figuratively." Poirot spoke gently. "Your name remains. But perhaps now, madame, it will be carried with honesty rather than legend." She said nothing. Poirot rose to leave. At the door, she called, "Do you think justice was served?" He turned. "Justice, madame, is not always satisfying. It does not bring back the dead. It does not erase the lie, but it gives the truth a voice." And with that, he left Tremaine Hall. The rain had stopped entirely now. The sky above was clear, the gravel beneath his feet firm and familiar. His car waited at the end of the drive, and as he climbed inside, Poirot took one last look at the estate in the rearview mirror. The teacup had shattered, but from its pieces, truth had spilled. 2 weeks had passed since Hercule Poirot departed from Tremaine Hall, and in that time the world beyond the estate resumed its natural rhythm. The newspapers had their headline, "Butler charged in Teacup murder." There were articles full of conjecture, embellished portraits of Tremaine Hall as a Gothic bastion of secrets, complete with photographs of the grand staircase and wide, unspeaking windows. Poirot read none of them. He had returned to London, where he allowed himself the comfort of his apartment, the symmetry of his perfectly aligned furniture, and the measured quiet of a world he could control. It was in that space, among precisely trimmed rosebuds and polished silver desk trays, that he reviewed the official documents Inspector Lambert had sent him. James Harwood had made a full confession, one that aligned with Poirot's deductions almost exactly. It had taken little prompting. Once faced with the depth of evidence and the exposure of his forgery from decades ago, Harwood admitted his actions without theatrics. The spoon had been his method, meticulously treated with Digitalis weeks prior and stored until the luncheon where Beatrice Morton sat in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong knowledge. Harwood claimed that he did not hate her. Quite the opposite. He admired her intellect, but he said, in his precise, restrained handwriting, "I have built a life around something that cannot withstand daylight. She would have destroyed everything, and I could not allow that. It was not remorse, it was admission." Delphine Edgecombe's involvement was more tragic. Harwood had used her anxiety and devotion to the Tremaines as levers. He never told her to poison Beatrice. He merely allowed her to believe that it had to be done. Then, when Delphine faltered under scrutiny, he finished what he had started. Her tea, served in the holding cell, was never tested until it was too late. Harwood had been placed in protective custody ahead of a full trial, though Poirot expected the man would not live long enough to face formal sentencing. Not because of danger, but because of age. His health was already declining. And so, in the end, he would likely fade behind bars, his final days spent not in service, but in silence. Poirot, however, had no intention of forgetting the matter. He recorded it carefully in his private journals. The teacup, the spoon, the missing letter, the lives broken not by malice, but by secrecy. He titled the entry, "A Death Served with Elegance." One morning, as he finished adjusting the angle of his desk blotter by exactly 1/2 centimeter, a letter arrived from Lady Tremaine. It was handwritten in fine script on thick cream paper. "Monsieur Poirot, I do not expect a reply. I only wish to thank you for your precision, your courtesy, and above all, your truthfulness. The aftermath here has been subdued. We have reduced our staff, closed the estate to visitors, and begun a full review of the family records. For the first time, I am aware of every inch of this land, every brick of this house, and it no longer feels like a legacy. It feels like a burden we must now carry honestly. Clara has left for Geneva to continue her studies. Augustus Vale, surprisingly, offered a donation to a local history trust to begin an audit of land ownership across the county. I suppose we are all, in our own ways, seeking penance. I have decided to open the East Wing Library to the public once a month. Beatrice would have liked that. Her notes are being archived, her sketches, her research. They were almost lost, but not entirely. Thank you again for restoring not just order, but clarity. Lady Helena Tremaine Poirot folded the letter precisely and placed it in the drawer beside his magnifying glass. Later that day, he visited Whitehall to deliver the final report in person. Lambert met him there, nodding with understated respect as Poirot entered the small conference room. "She really shook the tree, didn't she?" Lambert remarked, sliding over a cup of lukewarm coffee. "Miss Morton, I mean." Poirot declined the coffee. She had the audacity to ask questions no one else dared. That is often the beginning of both discovery and danger. Lambert tapped a file. "We're beginning a broader audit now. Land titles across the county. Harwood's forgery may not be the only one." Poirot allowed himself a faint smile. "Crimes, like weeds, often grow in clusters. But now the soil is being turned. And Harwood?" Lambert asked. Poirot shrugged gently. "He is awaiting a hearing, but I suspect his time is limited. His crime has already rendered its punishment. He lives now with the collapse of everything he protected. It is a sentence, no?" Lambert leaned back. "Still, you've got to admire how cleanly he did it." "It was almost perfect." "Almost," Poirot echoed, "but even the perfect crime cannot erase the smallest imperfection. In this case, a spoon. And one woman's curiosity." He paused. "There is something else, Inspector." "Something I did not include in the report." Lambert raised an eyebrow. Poirot reached into his coat and withdrew a second, older document, one he had discovered hidden inside Beatrice Morton's notebook, taped behind the final page. It was not part of the land forgery. It was a personal letter, dated 2 years earlier. From Rupert Tremaine. "My dearest Beatrice, what you found, what you suspect, is not your burden to carry. I made peace with it long ago. The estate stands on altered ground, yes, but it has also stood for generosity, for community, for art. I ask you not to destroy what good has been done for the sake of what once was flawed. If you must act, do so gently. The truth matters, but so does grace. With all affection, Rupert." Lambert read it twice. "She never meant to go public with it, did she?" Poirot shook his head. "She wanted answers. Not revenge. But James did not understand that. His world was binary. Exposure or silence. She offered mercy. He responded with poison." Lambert folded the letter and handed it back. "Maybe you should be the one to decide what happens to that." Poirot returned it to his pocket. "I already have." That evening, Poirot posted the letter back to Lady Tremaine, unsigned, unmentioned, simply addressed with no note enclosed. Let the family read it. Let them decide how to carry their legacy forward. Poirot stood at his window that night, watching the lights of the city flicker below. He had solved many murders, uncovered lies woven beneath lace and wealth. But there was something about this case that lingered. Perhaps it was the weapon, a teacup, elegant and ordinary. Perhaps it was the setting, an English estate built on elegance and error. Or perhaps it was the lesson that sometimes the dead do not haunt us through screams or shadows. Sometimes they haunt us through the truths they leave behind. A soft fog had settled over London that morning, clinging to the rooftops and brushing the edges of the Thames like a veil. In his immaculate flat on Whitehaven Mansions, Hercule Poirot sat before a modest breakfast, black coffee, 2 neatly trimmed slices of toast, and a boiled egg positioned at precisely the right angle in his cup. Everything around him, from the polished brass of the fireplace to the exact alignment of the Persian rug's border, was as it should be. Yet Poirot's mind was not in his flat. It remained with the shattered porcelain of Tremaine Hall, with a woman whose questions turned fatal, a servant whose silence turned deadly, and a family whose foundations had rested quietly on altered lines. He pushed the toast aside and opened his diary. In careful script, he wrote one final entry beneath the heading, "The Poison in the Teacup." Epilogue. The truth, once uncovered, is a creature without a leash. It travels, it unsettles, it demands that others follow its trail, whether they wish to or not, and in the case of Beatrice Morton, it proved fatal. She saw something others ignored. She pressed when others deflected, and for that she died, not in fire or struggle, but in a whisper of tea and silver. Her murder was not loud, it was precise, like everything James Harwood ever did. Poirot paused, his pen resting between his fingers. In the end, justice was served, but it was not triumphant. Harwood confessed, yes, but he did not weep. He did not beg. He spoke only of necessity. "I could not allow it," he said. As if the truth were a misbehaving child, as if morality were a matter of convenience. He dipped the pen once more. But justice, true justice, is not merely the arrest of a man. It is the restoration of balance, and for that, the survivors must carry it forward. He closed the diary gently, rose, and walked to the window. The city moved as it always did. Cabs passing through puddles, umbrellas tilting in the fog, bells ringing from some far church. Order and chaos, mingling like tea stirred in porcelain. Later that afternoon, he accepted a visitor, unexpected but not unwelcome. It was Clara Willoughby. She arrived in a beige coat, her hair pinned back simply, no longer with the nervous rigidity of a girl hiding from a scandal, but with the openness of someone who had survived one. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said softly. "No, mademoiselle," Poirot said, gesturing for her to sit. "You're always welcome." She sat and produced a wrapped parcel. "I thought you should have this. It's Beatrice's sketchbook, the original. Lady Tremaine didn't want to keep it. She said the estate would rather forget Poirot took it, unwrapped the twine, and opened the first page. Inside were delicate pencil drawings of the garden at Tremaine Hall, diagrams of architectural symmetry, snippets of annotated Latin from a land surveyor's journal, and midway through, a diagram of the disputed property lines. Lines circled. Arrows. Drawn notes scrawled in tidy capitals. Discrepancy between land grants filed in 1873 and 1881. See attached clause. She was brilliant, Clara said. Too brilliant. That's what scared them. Poirot closed the book gently. Brilliance is not a crime, but to some it is a threat. Clara nodded. I've enrolled in a history course. In Geneva. I thought maybe continuing her work would be the right thing to do. She never got the chance. Poirot smiled, a small, proud smile. It is most fitting, mademoiselle. A life carried forward by another. That is how the dead remain with us. She hesitated at the door before leaving. Did you ever regret it? All of it. The cases, the truths, the damage it causes. Poirot stood with her. There is always damage, mademoiselle. Truth does not come without a price. But regret? None. The only regret is when people are left in the dark. It is in darkness that evil thrives. She left him with a handshake, firmer this time. The flat returned to silence. Poirot placed the sketchbook on his bookshelf beside a small framed photograph of a much younger him and Hastings taken years ago in the countryside. Below it, he had placed a single inscription: Il faut chercher la vérité. You must seek the truth. And yet, he thought, the truth was rarely what people wanted. Most wanted simplicity, a name, a motive, a confession. But murder never unfolded so neatly. It came with misdirection, with silence, with half-seen gestures and moments overlooked. In the case of Beatrice Morton, it had come in the form of a spoon, a single, poisoned spoon. And that was the thing. It was never the teacup. The poison had been in the smallest detail, invisible to the distracted, obvious to the precise. Poirot turned back to his desk and reached for the chessboard. The game from Tremaine Hall, long unfinished, remained frozen. He moved the white bishop forward 3 spaces, placing the black king in check. A simple move, he murmured, and yet it changes everything. A knock came at the door again. This time, it was a telegram from Inspector Lambert. James Harwood died in his cell this morning. Natural causes, no final statement. Trial concluded in absence. Case closed. El Poirot folded the telegram, placed it in a drawer and looked out at the city again. The world would forget James Harwood. The papers would print his obituary with one line: former butler convicted of double murder. But they would not speak of the decades he lived hidden in plain sight, of the forged signature that changed the future of a family, of the woman who tried to expose it and was silenced not by hatred, but by fear. And that, Poirot thought, was what he feared most of all. Not the murder, not the lie, but the silence that wrapped around both like velvet. Poirot reached for his hat, straightened his cuffs, and stepped out into the city. He walked past newsstands that no longer bore headlines of Tremaine Hall, past children playing in puddles, past shops with their windows freshly cleaned. The world had moved on. But Poirot remembered, because that was his duty, not merely to solve, but to carry, to bear witness. And as he turned the corner and vanished into the London crowd, the rain began again. Soft, quiet, like the memory of a teacup breaking. End of final section, The Poison in the Teacup. A Hercule Poirot story. Would you like a polished title page and story description for your YouTube or audiobook upload? Spring in London had arrived at last, not with warmth, but with clarity. The fog had lifted, the rains had paused, and in the quiet order of Whitehaven mansions, Hercule Poirot polished his cufflinks with the precision of a man who had restored, not merely solved. The murder at Tremaine Hall had, to the public, concluded neatly. A confession, a motive, 2 deaths, 1 trial avoided by natural fate. The matter had left the newspapers, replaced by fresher scandals, and yet for Poirot the case lingered, not as a puzzle, but as a wound that had closed over an old truth. He sat at his writing desk, glancing at the final journal entry he had penned the day before. It was never the teacup. The poison was not in what she drank, but in what was hidden beneath. The lie long embedded in a family's legacy, unnoticed, permitted, and then protected at any cost. James Harwood did not kill for pleasure. He killed to preserve a fiction, and fiction, when left too long to harden, becomes belief. That is the real danger. Poirot set down his pen and rose. The day had meaning. He had agreed to meet a young inspector in training who had written to him for guidance. "I'm told you see not with the eyes, but with the mind," the young man had said. "Teach me that, if you can." But before leaving, Poirot made one final visit, to a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. It sat on his bookshelf, untouched since it arrived from Tremaine Hall. Beatrice Morton's sketchbook, her legacy. He opened it once more and flipped through its pages. He paused at a quote scrawled across the back page, Beatrice's own words, written in her delicate, exacting hand. "A truth uncovered late is still a truth." And if it costs something, then let it cost me. Better a shattered foundation than a palace built on silence. Poirot closed the book. No dramatics, no vengeance. Just a woman who believed knowledge should not be entombed by tradition. That afternoon, he met the young inspector, a nervous, stammering fellow with ink on his collar and hope in his eyes. "You must tell me," the young man asked, "how you knew." The butler, of all people. Poirot smiled gently. "Because, mon ami, everyone else had a mask." But the butler had vanished. Not from the room, but from the thoughts of others. And the truly dangerous man is the one no one watches. He gestured to a tea tray brought by the café server. "Tell me," he asked, "which cup is yours?" The young man blinked. "The one on the right, I think." Poirot chuckled softly. "No, it is mine. You see? Already you assume too much. The smallest error leads to the greatest mistake. That is the beginning of murder and of justice." The young man sat back, humbled. Poirot, lifting his cup, let the steam rise. "Murder is a performance, mon ami, but justice is an act of restoration." He sipped. It was too sweet, but he said nothing. Instead, he looked out over London, its rooftops clean from rain, its windows catching light. Another case was closed, but the duty remained. For wherever a lie rested too long, it was Poirot's task to disturb it, to lift the teacup and inspect the spoon.